In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie Mears.
And I'm Bing Giroux.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
Today here on the Sedgwick Strategies podcast, Primary Risk, we have Bill Lomax joining us. Bill, thanks for joining us today. Bill Lomax is a member of the Gitxsan Nation and grew up in Terrace, BC. He spent over 20 years working on Wall Street and in private equity in the United States, working with firms including Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and Smith Barney. A graduate of UBC's law school and Columbia University's MBA program, Mr. Lomax began his career in law facilitating land claim negotiations for British Columbia Treaty Commission. He later worked as a legal counsel for the Federal Department of Justice before entering the investment sector in the U.S. Currently, Bill serves as the president and CEO of the First Nations Bank of Canada, an over 80% Indigenous-owned and controlled Canadian chartered bank, primarily focused on providing financial services to the Indigenous marketplace. Thanks for being here with us today.
So great to be with you.
Can you tell us just a little bit about your journey? Because there's lots of people that grow up in small town BC, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that never go on to have some of these huge roles that you've taken on. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about how that all came together.
Sure. Well, growing up in Terrace, as you know, it is a small town, the kind of town where, as a kid, I had no idea what Wall Street was. I'd never heard about it, right? It was a big forestry town when I was a kid, and of course, it's gone through different phases. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the kids I went to school with did not necessarily fare well. Some of them did time, some of them went on to do other things, and not very many of them actually ended up going on to university. I moved with my mom at about 15 years old down to Vancouver and had figured out pretty early on that I wanted to go to university. A big part of that was kind of when I was up in Terrace, I saw my cousin, who was a carpenter at the time, end up out of work for about 2 years. And I thought, I don't want to be in that situation where I want to work and can't because there's a strike going on. And so I figured I would aim for something else, and I ended up going to university, as you mentioned, at UBC. That was a good experience. I figured out pretty quickly, though, that I actually didn't want to be a lawyer forever. I did want to kind of complete it. I'd figured it out actually before I left law school, but I wanted to complete the circle, so I worked for a few years, did my articles, and then decided that it was time to move on to do an MBA. Because I was really quite interested in the markets once I kind of figured out what they were. And I think part of my reasoning was, having worked at the Treaty Commission, I looked at the communities that I was serving, and they were in theory supposed to come into all this money. And, it's taken a long time, but that's starting to happen now. But what my concern was I saw all these nations that had great political leaders, lots of lawyers coming through law school, and virtually nobody who understood investments and financing that I could see. I just didn't meet anybody. And so I thought I could add more to the community. I thought I'd probably be a fine lawyer, but if I didn't do it, nobody would really miss me because there's so many other people to follow along behind me. But if I could go into something like investments and financing, I thought I could have a bigger impact on the communities. And so I decided the right way to do that was to go to kind of the heart of where investments happen, and that brought me to Wall Street. So that was a good experience.
Do you think that that's still the case? I mean, you've had a bit of a career now, obviously. I mean, the time you've spent on Wall Street. Are nations still challenged by the fact that they've got more lawyer advisors than financial advisors? Do you think that's still true?
I believe that we have a glut of lawyers. No offense to all the other lawyers out there. But yeah, in fact, I think we need to bring some of those lawyers laterally as hires into finance. I think, if you take a look at the numbers at any school, like pick a school, and see how many kids are going in to do their MBA and how many are doing a law degree and the Indigenous numbers just way outpace in the law school than they would on at the business school. It's just the reality when we try to look for young people who have just a basic business undergrad degree. It's a pretty slim number, and they're a hot commodity when they come out.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, we obviously this podcast a lot about major projects, building things, and those are obviously there's legalities to them, permits and approvals, but a big part of that is being able to put a deal together, the economics of that. So, it's interesting that your path that remains still unusual, given we're seeing nations come into their own, and like you said, they are starting to have that financial wealth and be able to make those decisions.
There's definitely more kids going into the space than there ever has been, but that's a really low bar, right? I think we look back historically, back into the 60s, we started to see nations, first of all, be able to finally hire lawyers, and then realize very quickly that they weren't getting the best representation from non-Indigenous lawyers. So there was a big push on from the time of the 70s and 80s to get young people into law, and they were wildly successful. We got, if you go to an Indigenous Bar Association, you get a lot of people coming, and it's only a fraction of the lawyers out there that are Indigenous. You try to put 50 Native MBAs in a room, and it's hard to do, right? I think we still have a ways to go, and I think when we had the 60s and 70s and 80s, we really needed law to advance our rights, and we still need lots of lawyers, no doubt about that. But the way forward, in my mind, is going to be on the business front. And so we need that human capital. We need more young people going into the banking space, the investment space, the business operation space. That's going to be where we see major growth for nations going forward.
And when you were on Wall Street, taking a step back to that, were you working, because your inspiration for going to school in the States and kind of hitting Wall Street and working for some of these major firms, were you doing deals, with an Indigenous lens? Like, has it shifted at all on Wall Street in Canada with the TSX? Are these deals coming together from an Indigenous lens? And how did you kind of, blend your background in law and as an Indigenous person into a pretty, intense industry in North America?
Definitely. There was a lot going on down in the States when I got there. I just happened to be showing up at a time, and I think there's a lot of parallels to when I arrived to where we are now. When I arrived in the States, the nations were really just starting to come into their money. Casino business was really blooming in a big way for the tribes. If you look back around 2003, when I got out of business school, I don't quote me on this, but I think the revenue for tribal gaming was maybe around $8 or $9 billion across the country. So that's substantial. But last year was I haven't checked last year's stats, but I'm sure it was probably $43 or $44 billion. Wow. And the average profit margin for the tribes down there is somewhere around 50%.
Wow.
So this has just created an enormous cycle of wealth for a lot of nations down there. But back in 2003, it was really just getting going. And so, there's an old saying in business and banking, being early is the same as being wrong. And I got there a little bit early, not too early, but a little bit early. And but eventually the thesis proved out, and the wealth came, and the business opportunities were enormous. I think that's happening here now. We're starting to see nations really coming into their money. This time, I don't think I'm early. By the way, I think I'm right on time, and we're ready to do a lot of the business that's going to be coming our way.
There's a substantial amount of wealth down there. Are they taking an interest because perhaps they're a little ahead in terms of their having how much money they have because of the casinos? Are they looking at investing in Indigenous projects in Canada? Is that something you're coming across?
I don't see a lot of that happening currently, but I think there's room for it. It's just a matter of getting their attention. And there's plenty of options for them to do business down in the States. And people tend to stick with what they know. I think the biggest opportunities are probably with maybe some of the Alaska Native corporations that are sort of close and have a lot of experience in investing in other industries and maybe looking for new hunting grounds, if you will. So I think there's probably some room with them. And there's probably some tribes in the right circumstances who would be quite interested in coming up. But I don't think there's a whole bunch of them that are just sitting and waiting to come up here to invest their money.
I was just thinking of where a nice pool of capital might be.
Yeah.
Well, I love that. And, you've kind of come full circle back into coming back to Canada, speaking about your inspiration for going to the US and getting your MBA and coming back and really being at the nexus of leading the First Nations Bank of Canada and getting to work with nations, work with communities, see them grow, see them invest money, and see them really build their own businesses. Can you tell us a bit about what you see as the CEO of the First Nations Bank of Canada? Does industry come to you? Can they? Who are your customers? And what kind of unique, and I'm asking you a lot of questions, but what kind of unique things are you guys building at the First Nations Bank of Canada? I know you guys are partnering with CIB, et cetera.
Sure. Well, I'll try to answer as many of those as I can.
Thank you.
So in terms of the kind of business that we do, industry comes to us a little bit, but honestly, that's not our bread and butter. It's not really what that's not who we exist for. We are in the business of providing capital for Indigenous communities. We had a fantastic deal about 8 months come out to us on all aspects. If it had been owned by an Indigenous community, we would have 100% done the deal. But it wasn't. And so we said, you know what, I think you should go to another bank because we want to reserve our capital for the nations that we're working with. And so that's just where we exist. Where we do finance non-Indigenous businesses is where they're embedded within the community. So if there's a store that happens to be in a fly-in community and it's the only store there, we might be the only option for them to get financing, and so we will do that kind of business. But that's less than 10% of the business that we do overall. So let's see, what were some of the questions in there?
I'll ask one more.
Sure.
I'll go back to it, but who are your customers? So you said they're mostly Indigenous, Indigenous communities, and then
nations, or also their ECDEV wings, or their
all of the
individuals?
above. Yeah, all of the above. So we have on the individual side, we have personal loans, we have mortgages, we do a lot of that kind of business. We do a lot of ECDEV work for sure. And that's we consider that just part of the nature of what we do. It's actually one of the things I think we do best. And then we work with the nations directly on things that they have interest in. Maybe the nation wants to build a school or do some infrastructure project or something like that. That's outside of what the ECDEV would do, and we absolutely do all of that kind of business. So we work with nations all across the country. And both coast to coast to coast, when you look at us, we've been mostly strong kind of in the middle, and then in the far north. Now we're very much expanding east and west. Our footprint here in BC is going to grow pretty substantially over the next year, as well as in Alberta and Ontario, and then heading east from there.
And so, maybe sort of getting back to some of the things we talk about in this podcast, or these major projects. So we talked a little bit before the podcast about where the bank fits in that space. Is this a place that you would be, as we're seeing nations wanting to take greater equity in projects, we're seeing nations who are perhaps getting revenue streams, taking a greater role in those types of things? Do you see that as a future for the bank, or is that something you want to leave to the other players in the field?
No, we don't want to leave anything to them over the long term. Over the short term, we have certain things we can and can't do. So right now, if you're a community anywhere in the country and you want a loan from us, we typically, with our own lending capabilities, have to cap out at around $20 million. Currently, we're raising new capital, and so I think that will get closer to $30 million by next year. But then we work with our partners, and so with our partners, we can usually double or triple that amount. So, a deal that's sort of $50 to $70 million is entirely possible for us.
Well, that would get
and
you
we'll
into
be
some decent-sized mining projects, for
Exactly.
example.
But the multi-$100 million projects, no, those aren't necessarily a fit for us on the face of it. So, but there may be a play for us in there if there are multiple nations working on them. So we see in several situations where multiple nations will come together for, a $500 million deal. And they, let's say if it's 10 nations, and they have to put in equity of, $10 or $20 million each. We could easily be the equity partner for the nation on that, and then somebody else can do the lending on the debt part. So there's a space for us in that. There's also a space for us in providing capital for those nations that are doing some of the procurement that may go along with that project. So if they're doing trucking, or if they're doing some kind of catering services, what have you, we can absolutely finance those kind of businesses.
Excellent, excellent. So this kind of takes us. We said again before the podcast we weren't going to do any politics. I'm gonna call me a liar. Okay. But what about these Indigenous loan guarantee programs? We see the British Columbia government's announced it. The Albertans are already doing it with AIOC.
Yeah.
The feds have announced it in their last budget. We're not really seeing what that means yet. But obviously you're looking at that. How would you see those things rolling out? What would you like to see with those programs coming out, the feds in particular?
Well, obviously, time is of the essence. We'd like to see them completed. Some of them are struggling to get up and running, but that is the nature of those kind of things. It's no easy task, and of course, more of them is better in general terms. But they have to be crafted correctly. There's, if we take a look down at the States, there was multi-billion. I'm going to try to take a stab in the dark. My recollection is about $20 billion that the federal government down in the States set aside for loan guarantees for tribes down there, and it never got used at all.
Just never taken advantage of?
Basically, just they never got it off the ground, and mainly because the parameters they set around it were impossible and not workable. And I've spent a lot of time talking with NRCan and other groups about feasibility and how to make them work. And I see a real desire to make them work, and they're looking at those kind of situations. And so, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. These are not easy things to get off the ground and do right and do well. But if they can get it together and get it done, I think they can be a very powerful tool.
Well, on that, you talked about providing advice to NRCan and to the U.S. government. What was that advice? I mean, we hear the differences between programs, even in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, which have provincial loan guarantee programs in place, are very different. So at the federal level, what was your advice to them around, because there was handcuffs in the States?
What were the mistakes the Americans made?
Yeah, that we can learn from.
What I've talked about pretty openly in the mistake side of things is just you have to set up the loan guarantee so that it works for the banks. Because if the banks can't make it work from their underwriting perspective, it's not going to fly at all. And so, and that means a lot of discussion with the banks. And maybe more so than what the people who are going to get the money think should happen. I don't know. But I can tell you that if you can't get the banks to use it, then it's of no value. So there has to be an understanding of the underwriting process for the banks. And then, of course, the risk, and they're the folks that I've talked to are well aware of this, is making it, trying to find a way to make it so that all the benefit actually goes to the nation rather than to, the partner, right? The non-Indigenous partner who may come in on a deal. You don't want them running away with all the benefits that come from that loan guarantee program.
Well, yeah, it's such a live argument right now. Federal and provincial governments facing elections, but we here would love to see a little more of that. Certainly, the lack. Well, let's talk about this in the context of your personal experience and maybe how you got into this field. Like, it's been pretty clear that it's been difficult for Indigenous businesses, certainly Indigenous communities, Indigenous related entities, to get access to cheap capital, cheap money. Is that something your bank is trying to overcome? And maybe talk about it in the context of your bank, but also the broader issue, the broader problem. Like, why do we have to do this, right? Why is it important?
I don't think I have the same perspective as maybe some folks you've talked to or have heard about in the past. There's a lot of talk about how there's a highly limited access to capital, and I think to some extent there's truth to that. But I can tell you that the landscape has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. It used to be that the bank would go out and on a deal and might be the only one who actually bid on it. Right now, if you go out and there's a bankable deal, everybody's showing up. So there's not necessarily a lack of capital. There's a challenge with making sure that the deal is bankable. There's oftentimes you will find folks who are not necessarily working in the best interest of the nation, coming out with and convincing folks that there's a deal to be done that will be very good for them, but in fact is really just good for the person who's trying to sell the deal. And you don't want it to be full employment clause for the consultants either, right? So what I think where I think we can see a lot more lending is on, and where there's a gap, I think, is on deals that might not otherwise be bankable. And that can be where the capital can make a big difference. Something that's really sort of on the edge at a normal,
like a higher risk project, or
or not necessarily even a higher risk project, but like if we take a look at, say, a clean energy project, right? If we have a power purchase agreement, that's a fixed price contract for the energy, right? And you kind of know what your costs are on the other side. And there's a gap between those two, which is your profit margin. And sometimes those things are basically right up to the line if you're paying normal bank rates. If you're paying 6%, 7%, 8% for your banking, not that we're at 8%, but depending on the deal, some banks might get up that high. If you can get that at 3%, all of a sudden that deal just becomes all that much more interesting for the nation. And so those loan guarantee programs can really help in that kind of situation to make it valuable and to the nation.
So, advice in that. So you're the banker, you're the financier, you're the investment guy. We're dealing with First Nations who are looking at major projects, and perhaps lesser major projects. That may be within your bank's range, but we're also talking to private sector companies and proponents who are bringing this forward. What advice would you give them in the sort of the current sort of economic climate, but also the political climate? Like, what typical advice would you give to those two different parties if they're looking at something that maybe your bank could take advantage of, let's say a smaller mining project? If they're looking at doing that, what advice would you give to them before they jumped into bed together, right?
Sure. Well, for the non-Indigenous group that wants to do business, really understanding what they're getting into and the value that nations bring. One of those is just certainty of the project, right? If the nation is on board for something that's happening on their land, then your ability to actually move forward, if it moves up substantially. And so there's that certainty comes, there's a lot of value for that, right? For the nations, it's interesting. I think what I hear whenever I go out is this desire to have equity in everything. And I think that's really makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases, but not every case.
I totally agree with you, Bill.
Case.
I mean, I don't mean to cut you off,
Sure.
but I think having equity in projects is incredible. And I think we should be moving forward in a huge way. And obviously, organizations like yours are really helping nations to do that. But I do think that there are certain investments that
it's not the holy grail.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And, maybe in 10, 20 years, but it's tough because mining, for example, I mean,
way up
it's a
the risk curve,
commodity
right?
market is crazy right now. And I mean, taking that risk and then putting that on nations, there's lots of cities that wouldn't invest in mines, nor would nations. So what are your
Equity goes to zero oftentimes. Business, if a company goes out of business, the pressure happens first on the equity front. So if your equity goes to zero, then the only people who are going to get paid, if the value of the company is worth is less than what's owed to the banks, there's no equity left, and then only the banks get paid with whatever's left. And that's not always a great position for the banks, but it's a better position than for those in the equity side of things. Bill Lomax, who used to be our chair, tells this great story about how the Cree of Northern Quebec came to a deal with Quebec Hydro. And I'll probably butcher this story a little bit, but I'll do my best to kind of capture it, which is he basically said that they looked at it and they said, you know what? The last thing in the world we want to do is be equity partners with Quebec Hydro. What we'd rather do is just take a toll on the electricity that's sold. We want a piece of every kilojoule that's sold. And so that's what they did. They said, you know what, you guys keep your equity and just pay us for everything that you produce off of the dams. And that was 100% the right move for them because Quebec Hydro has made so many missteps along the way. They've been near bankruptcy and had all these different problems. The equity value has jumped around all over the place, but the Cree kept getting paid.
So sometimes, it's, equity is maybe the current flavor of the month, I guess, but sometimes just a good old benefits agreement where you've got a revenue stream is...
Every deal is different. I mean, equity will be the only real valuable option in some cases, but it's not the only thing, and you should always consider what the options might be for you.
And speaking of equity and advice to a lot of the people that come into your organization to do business with you, equity makes sense, as we were talking about earlier, for a lot of rate-regulated utilities. You have a PPA agreement, you understand what the return is going to be. And then we talked a bit about mining, but let's talk a bit about projects that are in early stage. So, what would your advice be if you had a nation come in to say, hey, there's this hydro project that's being, proposed. They haven't started anything. They haven't filed a 43-101. They haven't done anything for this project yet. They're asking us to take equity. What would you say to a nation if they asked that?
Hard to say on the hypothetical, but be careful. Right? Are you, what form is the equity coming in? Are you having to put in a bunch of money to make it happen? I've seen so many situations where somebody comes to the nation and says, I've got this amazing deal for you. All you have to do is put in all the money and I'll make it work for you and I'll take half the profits. So if that's the situation, then, run away screaming. That's
what we need.
Sage advice.
More
Sage
financial
advice.
guys and less lawyers.
If they're coming in with real dollars of their own and you do your due diligence on the company and they're a legitimate company that you can see audits for and you can get some sort of references from, then it might be the right thing to do. It depends on how the equity is structured and what they're asking from the nation. If it's happening on their land, then that's probably more than enough equity in a lot of situations. They don't necessarily need cash in the deal. In some cases, they may want to put cash in the deal because maybe that can make it all that much sweeter. But you have to really understand the numbers. And by the way, spend money and get good experts.
I met you through FNMPC, and I know they have lots of advisors. I know your group has lots of advisors. First Nations Management Board has great advisors as well. So lots of people to lean on there. I kind of want to bring it back a bit to you, if that's okay. Because we talked a bit about you at the beginning and a bit about your journey, but I'm kind of curious. I mean, you obviously had pretty high stress job when you were working down south, and you do now. What do you do to ground yourself? What do you do to relax in your spare time? Curious about that.
There's a limited amount of free time I have. I cycle a lot. I've been doing that since I got home, which is great. So I live in Kitts and I work in Park Royal. So I like to ride to work. In fact, today I rode there and rode back. Um, and, that's great. As my wife, I think the first time I did it, was a little shocked because I came home and instead of being grumpy after work, I was all pumped up. And she's kind of like, "You've got too much energy. You need to go outside or something."
Mow the lawn.
Right. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think, being disciplined about exercise is really important for me in order to keep sort of stress levels down, and then making sure that I have enough time for the family, given the amount of travel that I have to do.
What about on the cultural side of that, in terms of keeping grounded? I mean, your nation is way up north. Do you get up often? Do you still have family up there? How do you keep yourself grounded in those things?
Yeah, I think, I don't get up as much as I'd like. There's no doubt about that, but it's a lot easier now that I'm back. Family, I think, is the main thing. My mother is kind of the rock in that front. So we spend a lot of time with her, and then, relatives, that kind of thing. And, I'm fortunate, when we were in San Francisco, one of the big concerns that I had is my kids had no access to the Indigenous community because there really wasn't one in the neighborhood we were in, right? There just were no Native kids in that space. And it was fine for me because I was around Native people all day through work, and I feel a little bit like my job provides me a lot of that kind of cultural feedback. Coming home, it was important to get the kids closer to the community, and so that's
it's a little
part of what
easier
we're
in
doing.
Vancouver.
Yeah.
There's a lot more going on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's urban reserves and, easier travel back to your nation.
We run into Native people all over the place, right? In Vancouver, that just didn't happen in San Francisco much.
So the title of our podcast is Primary Risk, and we like to talk about the primary risks associated with major projects. So maybe you could give us sort of what you think the primary risk is right now with Indigenous people and sort of the landscape of investing in major projects, working in taking equity in other sort of service companies related to major projects.
I think one of the biggest risks is just human capital. We have lots of human capital, but we're not necessarily getting enough of them with the training that they need to be able to manage the influx of wealth and opportunity that we're seeing. And so there has to be a real push to get young people moving. And I kind of alluded to it earlier. I think, honestly, we got to take a certain percentage of folks who are in other industries, law, education, where we might have a lot of folks already working and being good professionals, and encouraging them to do a lateral shift, especially if they're not happy with their career. Find a way into the business side of things, because it doesn't take that many years of experience to become pretty valuable to your nation on the finance side, but it does take a few years, right? So, but if we had a lot of people going into business operations, into finance and accounting, I think that would really make a big difference for nations going forward. Because if we don't get that human capital, it's very hard to make those businesses successful. And without those businesses being successful, you're not going to see the transformation you want. Finance is one part of nation building. The businesses are a part of nation building. They're not the only part, but it's very hard to do things like language revitalization, drug and alcohol treatments, and all the good things, housing projects, all those things, they require money. So you're not going to get it all from the federal government. So you have to find your own way of creating wealth so that you can fund those things.
Absolutely.
Well, that sort of opens up a line of questions that I hadn't actually considered. So clearly there's a growing need for financial advisors and people with financial and business experience as nations are coming more into wealth, into these major projects, which is the focus of this podcast. But is the path there? I mean, it's one thing to go do your business undergrad, and obviously an MBA is the next step, but are kids getting the right math skills, or are those things like, what's the path for a lot of, for any kid, but in particular for Indigenous kids to get into that into finance or business?
I think the math side of things, you have to have basic math, but you don't have to be. It's not like going into statistics or advanced math. The math that you do
Spreadsheet
on a
math.
on a daily basis in banking is actually not that challenging. Grade 10 kind of level in a lot of ways, right? But you have to have the basics, and you have to feel comfortable in that space. But they're outside of financial engineers. The average banker is not spending a lot of time, calculating integrals or doing derivatives, right? Even if you need something like that, you've got a program that'll do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to basically understand, okay, if I calculate this number, what's its likely direction, so that if a number that you come out with is really wildly off, you're going to spot it, right? Because you're heavily reliant on computers and spreadsheets and whatnot, and sometimes a number goes in wrong. So it's good to have that experience to understand. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a math wizard to do it. You just have to be able to do basic math.
And I think we're really lucky as well to have you back in Canada and to be an inspiration, because I think that's part of it, right? I mean, like in any example, it's really important for people to see people in positions of leadership in the banking sector where they say, hey, that's, someone I know, that's an Indigenous man or woman or person that's there. And I think between you, Jamie Lickers with CIBC, we have Cherie Brandt, who's on the board of TD, Roberta Jameson with RBC. I mean, there's all of these examples of Indigenous leaders now at the board level or in very senior levels in major banks in Canada that are, I think, creating some of those examples. So hopefully that'll kind of help in the next generation of Indigenous leaders they're progressing into those roles.
I hope so. I think, when I was getting started, I tried to talk to folks who were ahead of me, and there were just so very few of them, right? I actually didn't meet any in Canada. I met a couple down in the States. That doesn't mean there weren't any in Canada. I had no access to them. Because there were a couple of folks who were clearly several years ahead of me. But there should be, a lot of people ahead of me, and there's not. In fact, the ones that are just behind me, say 10 years behind me, that area is still pretty sparse, right? You bring, I don't know how old Jamie is, but I'm going to guess she's at least 10 years younger than me. And we should have 20 more of her, than we do out there. But we don't. And so, I'm glad that she's there, but we need a lot more. And so as we look further down the pipeline, that number is growing, and we need it to grow substantially more.
Awesome. Well, a PSA for all Indigenous youth out there to make sure that you consider going into a slightly different direction and following in your footsteps.
Yeah, it's not a law school.
Yes.
I've certainly learned a ton from you today and really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you to our audience for listening to Primary Risk. As you know, this is your first time doing a podcast. We really appreciate having you on. Please follow us to receive notifications of upcoming episodes wherever you get your podcast. Check out the show notes for references to any materials that Bill or Bing or I mentioned during today's discussion, and new episodes will be released monthly. We are excited to announce our upcoming speakers, so be sure to follow us on LinkedIn to receive news, updates, and announcements. And until the next episode, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
It's been great.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.